Shalom and welcome to this special book launch event, which is part of the Ghetto Fighters House International online series Talking Memory. My name is Medine Shachar and I work at the Ghetto Fighters House as a guide and educator. I want to welcome our global audience from all over the world, as you can see in the chat, including friends and colleagues from Holocaust museums, institutions and centers, academics and students from universities, historians, and our many friends who attend our Talking Memory series. A special welcome as always to the survivors and their families that are with us today. We want to thank everyone for their support and interest in our programs. And today's program is in partnership with our dear friends at Classrooms Without Borders. Today's program is a book launch event for the upcoming release of the book Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, written by our special guest, Professor Natalia Aleksiun. After the introductions, Professor Aleksiun will give a short introduction herself to the subject of her book, and then Professor Silber will join her in conversation about her work. We will have time, as I said before, for questions at the end of the talk. And just a few opening thoughts before we start. Today's program is about identity, about community, about the belief in the power of history to change the world. And as Professor Aleksiun states in her book, a source of hope and solace, to argue the rightful place of Jews in Poland. It sounds so simple, so easy, so obvious. And yet, the readers of Professor Aleksiun's book know something that the Jewish historians in interwar Poland could never have imagined or fathomed. I am sure that this discussion today will leave us with many questions and even concerns about how history is written and by whom, especially today. I also want to acknowledge that today is June 6th, and that marks the World War II D-Day invasion of Normandy by the Allied troops. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge all the soldiers that fought in this battle and those that lost their lives defending human freedom. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Natalia Aleksiun is Professor of Modern Jewish History at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies, Touro College in New York. She has published extensively on Polish Jewish history, Jewish historiography, and Polish-Jewish relations in the 20th century. She co-edited 2 volumes of Polin, examining Holocaust memory and Jewish historiography. Recently, she published a critical edition of The Destruction of Zolkiev, I'm saying it properly, Zolkiev, Jews by Gershon Tafet. Her book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, is published by the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization in association with Liverpool University Press. And it will be released, hopefully, on July 1st. And this is the reason for the book launch event today. She's preparing a volume of Polin devoted to Jewish childhoods, children, and child rearing in Eastern Europe, and a monograph on Jews in hiding in Eastern Galicia during the Holocaust. She is co-editor-in-chief of East European Jewish Affairs. Among several prestigious fellowships, she has been a fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich and the Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies in Vienna, and the Pearl Resnick Postdoctoral Fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C. And with her today is Marcus Silber, who is an associate professor at the Department of Jewish History, University of Haifa. His main academic interest lay in the interplay between citizenship, language, and ethnicity. He wrote on Jewish diaspora nationalism, popular culture in interwar Poland, and Polish-Israeli relations and mutual migrations. Major publications: Different Nationality Equals Citizenship, the efforts to achieve autonomy for Polish Jewry during the First World War, that was released in Hebrew in 2014, and with Zimon Ludnicki, Polish-Israeli Diplomatic Relations, a selection of documents 1945 to 1967 in Polish and in Hebrew. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Aleksiun.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you very much to Ghetto Fighters House. I fell in love with the series, and I've actually been, all my Sundays were about listening and learning and reflecting on with the fantastic speakers that you hosted. So it's a true honor and pleasure to be on this side now, and I'm grateful to Classroom Without Borders, and I am grateful very much to Liverpool University Press and Littman Library of Jewish Civilization, who made this book happen. And I also appreciate your presence, all of you, since we have all been to so many Zooms in the last year. And so I appreciate that you spent this next hour talking together with us about Jewish historians. On the surface, maybe not the most exciting topic for Sunday afternoon, but I hope I will, with the help of my dear friend and wonderful scholar, Marcus Silber, I hope to convince you that this is in fact a very, very exciting topic. Let me now share with you just a few thoughts about my topic. Oh, I've been now disabled from sharing. So if this can be changed, this would be wonderful. But let me start before my rights are restored. So let me share with you a few thoughts about conscious history. This book that focuses on intellectual trajectory from 19th century, but really the heart of it is in the interwar period, and it ends with the outbreak of the Second World War. However, of course, throughout writing this book and throughout all these stories, I, as an author and as a historian, I was deeply aware of what was coming, and therefore I want to start with a scene that took place in December 1942 at the Jewish cemetery at Okopova Street, when Meyer Bauerban, the Dean of Polish Jewish Historians, was being buried, still fortunate to have a funeral, at which one of his closest students, Hillel Zeidman, here you see his student ID, actually marking his place due to the introduction of ghetto benches on one side of the lecturing hall. And Hillel Zeidman was speaking in the name of all students of Meyer Bauerban, reflecting on the fact that the historian of Polish Jewry was being put to rest just as Polish Jewry was being murdered. And this is a very symbolic moment, very real moment and historic moment, because indeed of this cohort that my book is talking about, very, very few survived. You see here the three founding pioneering fathers. Yitzhak Schipper was murdered in Majdanek. Moshe Shor was killed, died in a Soviet camp in Uzbekistan. Bauerban died in Warsaw Ghetto. The historian of whom I'm sure all of you had read, Emanuel Ringelblum, was murdered in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto after his bunker was discovered. But many other of the men and women that I studied did not survive the Holocaust. And so I'm looking at the cohort that in some ways I believe has been forgotten, because it was murdered for the most part, not just the historians, but also the community for which they were writing. So here you see just a few student files, documents, especially the high school diplomas. I copied them because they have these lovely pictures. And it's not an accident that you see three women. There's a substantial number of women among historians of this cohort. But the book on the right side by David Wurm. David Wurm was shot right after Barbarossa in his hometown of Brody, together with many other members of Jewish intelligentsia. But taking a step back from this end that is in store, what I was hoping to tell is a project of writing history, just like Medine mentioned, a history that is not just an academic project, that is a project of community building, of community strengthening, of giving to the community sort of intellectual arguments, but also a sense of belonging and a sense of separate identity, not just as Jews, not just as Eastern European Jews, but as Polish Jews, as something quite different, connected to the general history of Jews, to Eastern European Jewish history, to history of Ashkenaz, but also specific to Polish lands, and specific to Polish lands through history. It's also a history of creating new intellectual centers. You have here marked with big dots university cities where big numbers of Jewish students studied in the interwar period, and the map is that of the Second Polish Republic. However, my focus is on Warsaw really, because in Warsaw, despite the fact that like in other universities, especially in the 30s, this was not a welcoming place. Ghetto benches were introduced. There are regular acts of violence, but specifically for those who studied history, there was a relatively welcoming atmosphere, especially connected to this man, Marceli Handelsman, who was himself in that gray zone between patriotic Pole, very much acculturated, very much connected to Polish political cause, a supporter of Piłsudski, but also someone who was very much interested in giving a helping hand to writing history that was not history of ethnic Poles only, supporting writing Jewish history as part of Polish history, writing Ukrainian history as part of Polish history, creating this multi-ethnic historiography that in a way, I think, was connected to a hope for a more open and accepting and embracing Poland rather than a nation state. This is also a place in which Jewish intellectuals themselves create institutions for themselves as a minority. There is the building that still exists and hosts a very important institution, Jewish Historical Institute, now in Warsaw. But in the interwar period, this was the site of the Institute of Judaic Studies, which trained teachers, social workers, rabbis, communal activists. You see here the students, likely the women were in a track for teaching, the boys tended to be in a track for rabbis, but they studied together and they all were very much immersed in a study of history as an important part of their training. And this is a cohort that goes through a fascinating period in which they come of age in the Second Polish Republic, again, in a context of claims made towards Jewish minority as if they were not really truly belonging in a country, as if they were guests, as if they were not really potentially even dangerous for the country, but at the same time, a community with tremendous cultural life, religious life. And so looking at these students, you have individuals who, I argue, many of them choose to come to Warsaw to study history. Now, I don't have many of the ego documents in which people would discuss their motivations, but if you come from a different town, from rather far away, and you choose to study in one university that actually offers courses in Polish Jewish history, it's likely a conscious choice rather than an accident. It's also a community that is in flux in terms of language, in terms of the kind of Jewish identity they envision. And you see here, for the few of you that don't read Polish, let me just explain. This is, again, a form filled by students annually or twice annually, where you declare your nationality, your citizenship, first your nationality, your mother tongue, and your your denomination, your religion. And so you see here Polish citizenship, Jewish nationality, Hebrew mother tongue, given that this is from the file of a Jewish woman from Łódź, very unlikely that she actually grew up speaking Hebrew. This is a declaration of her national identity, and then of course Mosaic faith. But there are all kinds of combinations, and in fact the same students between different years declare different mother tongues. They fluctuate between declaring Yiddish and Hebrew and sometimes Polish. And there is also a sense, especially among this young generation, that Jews, young Jews, need to write Polish Jewish history, that this is a field that doesn't sufficiently, has not been sufficiently developed. So Ringelblum and Raphael Mahler and this woman that you see here in the picture, Bella Mandelsberg, in the early 1920s, create a club, a seminar for students where, aside from university classes, they invite guests, they discuss together work, and Bella Mandelsberg actually works on her hometown, on Lublin, and continues to work throughout the interwar period and then in a ghetto, and likely some of her work has been lost in the ghetto. Part of the material that did survive was published after the war. And I said before, it's not just an academic project, it's a project for the community. And here you have a call to general public signed by various intellectuals, including Dubnow, including Balaban, whom I mentioned, and Schipper and Mahler and Ringelblum, about collecting the materials from local Jewish communities, the sense of urgency that the community needs to take care of its own history. It's also not a purely academic project, because university positions are not waiting for these men and women. And so they all really work in other fields, and they are engaged in history writing and history teaching while they're being military rabbis in the Polish army. So they speak to the newly drafted Jewish soldiers. They write prayers for Jewish soldiers. They are teachers, especially in the Jewish gymnasia. And in fact, a lot of memoirs mention those lessons of history. They write in Jewish press. They speak in the Polish parliament. So history is present far beyond academic journals and monographs, not to mention that it's not easy to publish given the economic difficulties, growing economic difficulties in the 30s. And I want to finish with a story that kind of I realized was part of my project, not knowing as I was working on it. So one of the students that I looked at and copied her file many years ago in the archive of Warsaw University was Franciszka Wiesenfeld. You can see her lovely picture here. And only later on did I realize that I actually had as my first Hebrew teacher at Hebrew University, her daughter. And that I was actually taken one Shabbat to visit Tzafrira Azrieli, who was a teacher of history for many years in Israel. She made Aliyah in 1937. She changed her name, and she was for many years a teacher of Jewish history. So I want to end on this note, because despite the destruction of the historians and of their audience, of their primary audience, because they wanted to speak to non-Jewish audience as well, there are people who, I believe, continued some parts of this project in academia as well, but also beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I want to invite Marco Silber to the discussion, and I will disappear again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia, for the presentation of your book. First of all, congratulations for the book. We, all of us, are expecting to discuss the book after reading it. I was I have the privilege of reading of reading it, and it is really fascinating. And I think, first of all, in order to open the discussion and maybe to get more insights from your side, I would say that this book offers us the opportunity to discuss many topics. And after this, after the presentation of the main framework of the book, we can begin to discuss some points that are very relevant. I would like to you presented some the framework from the war to the interwar period and to the post-war period, even to say to nowadays even. I would like to leave the afterlife of this Polish school, that it is very important from my point of view, and it is an important argument to focus it to the end of our discussion. But maybe I would like to begin discussing the generations you mentioned in your discussion. In the book, you are talking about 3, let's say, generations of Polish Jewish historian from pre-World War I to the war, to the Second World War, and this afterlife you mentioned. And you focused your presentation on the I would say the generation of the teachers, Bauerban, Shor, Schipper, and the Galician school that moved to Warsaw and became the Polish School of Polish Jewish History. I would like to, if you can maybe share with us your insights about the transition of the generations, the continuities and the discontinuities, and maybe focusing, maybe mentioning these 3 generations, or probably focusing more on these last 2 generations you mentioned in your general outlines of the book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marcos. Yeah, it's actually a great window to think of the transition and the continuity. So the book begins with, indeed, I'm not sure if genealogists would agree with calling them one generation, but it's a cohort that really shares a lot in common. Roughly speaking, a 19th century cohort, right? What's interesting about them is that unlike the generation of the Galicianers, the Bauerban, Schipper, Shor, and then people that train, some of them under them, some of them under other Polish historians who are professional historians, right? They have a diploma to show that the 19th century cohort is a cohort in some ways of amateurs. They are either autodidacts or they have legal training. And maybe this is also connected to then interest in history that they take, which is very much tied to the question of the legal status of the Jews. I mean, it shouldn't surprise us that lawyers are interested in that kind of legal discourse. What I find interesting about the 19th century cohort, people like Smoleński and Kraushar, is that this is a group that includes both Polish Poles, non-Jewish Poles, as Joanna Tokarska-Bakir, a scholar, an important scholar of Polish-Jewish relations. She's arguing for using this term Polish, Jewish Poles and non-Jewish Poles to stress the civic identity, not just the ethnic identity. But this 19th century cohort has both Jews, Poles of Mosaic faith, people who are kind of moving away from their Jewish identity, and in fact, some of them convert at some point in their life, such as Gumplowicz, and they seem to be sharing a lot of interest in what the questions they ask, the motivation for their work. And I think that this motivation for their work is something that I would definitely describe as a point of continuity, which is a certain pragmatic, maybe hopeful pragmatism would be the term, vis-a-vis history, that if you sufficiently study and explain the facts, you can change attitudes. Right? So Polish-Jewish relations, let's say in the Russian partition or in the Austrian partition, but especially in the Russian partition, as many of them are actually writing in Warsaw, that these relations will change once the past is explained. And so for many Jewish historians or people who write about Jewish history as Jews, it's a hope that that any kind of animosity is a result of ignorance. And so in fact, writing history is this Enlightenment project of mending tensions and divisions. And I believe that when we move to the generation of Bauerban, Schipper, and Shore and further, of course, they are a little more sophisticated and maybe less optimistic about the power of historical facts. But nevertheless, there is that sense, Ringelblum writes about the lack of Chinese wall dividing Christians and Jews in the past. And so how historians need to reveal it, that these were not two completely separate communities. And I think that there is this implication that if they were not completely separate, there should be more understanding now in the 1920s, 1930s. So that there is that continuity from the 19th century. And the second continuity, because I'm curious about your other questions, I could talk about it until the end of our hour. But the second continuity, I think, that stays as relevant is talking about Jewish contributions. Right, it's inquiring about what Jewish presence in Polish lands over the centuries did. But was it a good contribution? What did Jews give to Poland? And Jewish historians in particular are very, very conscious about the need to spell out this contribution and to explain out what is being used in the 19th century increasingly, and certainly in the 20th century, what is being increasingly used in the nationalist discourse, right? That Jews took over something, that Jews were overrepresented, that in trade or in commerce or in this or in that, but rather kind of shift this paradigm into, well, Jews were responsible for developing Polish towns. Jews were responsible for developing commerce across borders, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is important for 19th century, of course, is the question of Jewish participation in the Polish struggles for independence. This will be a theme that is constantly present. How many Jews participated in this uprising, in that uprising? How many Jews were devoted to Poland throughout partitions as well? And so, yes, I think that while methodology is certainly becoming more sophisticated, and the subject matters are becoming more richer and more diverse. These are the lines that I think the thread that we can follow from 1850s into late 1930s.
So in many ways you emphasize this this modernistic belief in progress and education that changed the world, that the society that changed in the interwar period. People, especially this generation that was educated or was educated as or formed as historians in the interwar period was much more was less optimistic in any case, but on the other hand, they developed tools to argue. They developed tools to the Jewish society to argue and to demand inclusion and equality. And from the book, it is clear that they are developing another path, and they are interested in another topics that superficially, we can say that they are very technical. But when after reading your analysis, you can understand that these are very political. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more how these very dry topics are so important as tools, as political tools, and how these, I would say, third generation of Jewish Polish historians are developing these tools for the Jewish society in general.
I don't think they're dry, but I'm obviously partial to their writing. But let me zoom into, as it were, two things that were in the PowerPoint as just a glimpse. And I agree with you that there is much more to them that meets the eye. One is local history. You saw this cover of David Wurm's study of Brody, one that is still being cited. I mean, it's a piece of research that did not lose its relevance for those who, especially who write on the history of Galicia and a history of Brody in particular. But if we look at the topics that this cohort wrote about, but their teachers to some extent as well, right? Shaw wrote on Przemyśl, Bałaban wrote on Lviv. This is inscribing Jews into the local histories. And I'm thinking about it, you know, even today, if I made this bold comparison, when we go online and read, short summaries of various towns on Wikipedia and beyond, how many of them, towns that were 50% Jewish population, 60% Jewish population and more, and there is often, especially in the Polish language, there is often not even a line. And at the point where you get important historical sites, you get, the ruins of a synagogue and a cemetery, and that's when you can discern that there is something to the history of the town that the short article is not telling. And I think in a way, this is exactly the making sure back then that that Jews in the local setting are being studied as part and parcel of the local setting. These are not local histories that are separated, cut off from everything else. This is integrated history at its best. And the second aspect that I would like to bring up is again, you saw a glimpse of it with Bella Mandelsberg-Schildkraut, are the histories of working class Jews, of Jewish merchants, Jewish artisans. Of course, it's connected also to her particular political lens. Like many of the members of the group of young historians, Ringelblum and Mahler, Bella Mandelsberg was a member of Palais Zion Left, so she was in a way writing something that very much aligned with the interest in working class Jews. But again, this is very political, both Jewishly, right? What subject is worthy of historical work for Jewish community? This is writing beyond famous rabbis. This is writing beyond famous Jewish leaders or Jewish institutions. But also this is writing vis-a-vis the discourse, political discourse at the time about kind of freeing Poland, working class Poles from Jewish domination. And so I think that this is what makes this work so not dry, even if upon first glance it does seem so, because they very much write against extremely heated and contemporary and timely discussions and speeches made in parliament and speeches made in city councils. So its history meets contemporary struggles very much on the page.
So you emphasize in the book, let's say, 3 topics that were in the maybe this newest cohort of historians were interested in, like economic history. You mentioned the institutional history. Again, it is a continuity with Balaban and Schipper and Shore, but they are developing this direction, and the local history is a way to integrate the Jewish Polish history in as part of the Polish landscape. I think that you use this expression. And, but institutional history is playing another role, also not only integrating it into the historical framework of Polish history, and they did that. They integrated this specific Polish institutions, the specific Polish institutions into the broader framework of Polish institutions in old Poland. But they are also discussing the new, discussing with, or arguing even with Dubnow and his new approach. Maybe it was to emphasize also this discussion.
Yes, thank you for this question. I was looking with one eye at something in a chat that mentions somebody's mother being taught by Dubnow. So of course there is a huge presence in the book that is not the main character in the story, but is very much, casts a very, very big shadow, which is Simon Dubnow and his concept of Jewish history and Jewish centers, but Eastern European Jewish history, and it's connected, of course, also to the language, to the language in which one writes Jewish history. So my historians, if I could own them for a moment in that way, they're very much in very much in ambivalent position, I think, vis-a-vis Dubnow's project, because they are part of this project. On the one hand, they publish in Еврейская Старина, that document that you saw, that press article that you saw from Literarische Blätter, was signed together by Dubnow, by Bauerban, Ringelblum, but at the same time, important core of my cohort are Galicianers. And that sets them apart. That sets them apart linguistically. They are much more interested in, well, one could say maybe even able, but certainly they aspire much more to writing in Polish than they would aspire to writing in Yiddish. They are much more interested in speaking to the Polish and Polish Jewish, acculturated Polish Jewish audience. And again, as I said earlier, while, and Bauerban has this programmatic article published in one of the journals, how Jewish history, and he draws a complicated geometrical figure that I think doesn't quite work well, but basically that what he believes Jewish history that he writes belongs to two Jewish and Polish history, and then you sort of, your focus is on that space created by these two lines. And so I think that they are much more explicit than Dubnow ever was, in that one could even say Polonocentric, maybe, project. And we could argue whether this limits them to some extent, because they are so invested in that particular discourse. Also Jewishly invested in that particular discourse. Again, this is for Dubnow not an essential line of delineating Jewish history. But at the same time, I think that they do belong to this broader intellectual body of Eastern European Jews interested in writing Jewish history, convinced that Jews need history, and Jews in Eastern Europe need their history, because otherwise it's going to be told by German Jews who don't understand Eastern European Jews at all. So while they might have their disagreements with Dubnow, and some of them might have their points of ambivalence about EVO Institute in Vilna, they have much more in common in this direction that in the context of German Jewish historiography.
So maybe this is one of the most, I think, crucial points in your argument, that this Polish Jewish school, that it is in the shadow of other biggest or more famous, so to speak, Jewish schools of historiography, and that it is very, with a very, let's say, complicated and very nuanced way of trying to understand the Jewish experience in the Polish lands, and even as an, I would say, as an example of other ways to understand the Jewish experience. And this junction you mentioned,
I think he calls it actually a cross.
Yeah, and I remember that it is the word, but I only showed that. Yeah, this junction, of this cross between the Jewish experience in the Polish lands as part of the Polish experience, but also simultaneously as part of a broader Jewish experience, that it is, I would use a neologism that was not used by them. It's a kind of transnational. And this specific way of trying to understand the Jewish experience in Poland, that in many ways, that it seems to me that crossed the borders of Poland, and when following this afterlife, we can see how it is, how many of the contemporary historiography is echoing these ideas. And maybe the first of them is the focus on the Jewish experience in Old Poland, not as a series of catastrophes, but as a very productive and creative period that, of course, and you mentioned that in the book, that it is in some way playing with Baron's famous statement about the lacrimose conception.
Yeah.
And my question is, to what extent Baron, before stating this famous expression, was aware and maybe following this old Polish school shaped by Galicians, not only from Tarnów, yeah, but that in many ways, grew up in a similar environment to that of Baron.
This is a fantastic question, and if you didn't mention a non-lacrimose vision of Jewish history, I would. But thank you for nailing it. And I think, well, this is something that I think someone should take up as maybe another book project, because there is a fantastic collection of material in Hoover Institute, David Engel worked with some of it, but there is more. There's more work that can be done. But I believe, I don't let my students use this verb in seminar papers, but I believe that there is something about this shared Galician cultural context that is responsible for the vision of the Polish Jewish past that is certainly present in the work of my historians, of historians who saw themselves as historians of Polish Jews. Baron certainly had a much wider net of his interest, but they share this ambivalence towards a vision of Jewish past as a vision of a perpetual victimization, and focus on, yes, like you said, full of nuance, nevertheless, to some extent, maybe even integrated, not in a modern sense integrated, but communities interacting very, very closely, and not only in a form of violence or persecution. So I do think that there is a shared intellectual context heritage to it. Do I have a smoking gun, as it were, a document, a letter in which Baron states it explicitly? No, but I think that the similarities are just too clear to be a coincidence completely. And I want to also touch on this, your use of the word transnational, which I like very much. And I think that we as historians writing today maybe have, we need to be cautious with vocabulary, but I agree that this is a transnational project. Transnational also because people emigrate. So Raphael Mahler leaves Poland right before the war. Jan Kewsiatski leaves for Evo, for New York. After the war, Philip Friedman leaves first for Germany and then for New York again. And then there will be people who leave for mandatory Palestine, like Franziska Wiesenfeld, like others, and who then emigrate to Israel after the war. So it's transnational also quite literally, because people cross borders with these ideas and with books and with memory of having lessons in Jewish history taught by students of. Now, what you mentioned earlier, which is the focus on old Poland, I want to pose it as a question. I don't have the answer, because the afterlife that, again, Marcus, you wanted to come back to, it's fascinating for me. And I saw briefly, I think Israel Bartal is with us, you know, what is the flow of continuity of ideas from the project of writing Polish Jewish history before the Holocaust to writing Polish Jewish history, you know, in the 80s, in the 90s by our teachers and ourselves. To what extent these continuities are conscious? What do we make of what seems like continuity, but do people actually consciously continue? And really so much fascinating work. You know, just thinking about Judith Kalik and Jakub Goldberg, her teacher, and Adam Teller, how much of this work you could read through that lens of pre-war historiographical tradition. Now, I don't know whether you can always trace this continuity, but I think it's becoming more clear. I think that this, just like, you know what, I would compare it to the life of Jewish testimonies. If you think about the project of collecting testimonies by Onek Shabbat archive, and then that period that seemingly didn't focus on this kind of documentation, and then the tremendous rise of interest in Holocaust studies, of these personal ego documents of Jews from the Holocaust. You know, what do we make of it? Is it a continuity? So what do we make of the break in between? I think that there is some kind of similarity here. It's not a straight line.
I think that you addressed many topics, but I would like to go back to two of them. The first one is this expression, the lacrimose conception, that maybe that, according to David Engel, Baron stated that when dealing with the old period, the pre-World War I period, and in this way, again, is in some ways reflecting the idea of you are transmitting in your book, because this interwar period, when this cohort of historians are addressing more contemporary topics, they are not showing them like they show this more more positive, so to speak, pre-war old Jewish history in old Poland. And in this way, again, it is some kind of play between Baron and this cohort of Galician, now Polish historians. That again, one more idea that is in your book is that again, Polish history is a construction, it's an intellectual construction made by the Galician Jews. And that it is interesting to see that it is not only this transnational connection, but also this regional transformation. That is one point. Or the second one. And the third one, maybe again, because you are now again referring to this afterlife. And I think that one of the, my feeling is that the importance of reading about historiography is not only discovering some uncovered writings that could be interesting and relevant, and some ways and to clean the dust from some old books, but I think that what is important is a kind of it is a kind of mirror. Through this mirror, through their work, we can examine our topics, our methodologies, and through them, our blind spots and truisms and biases. And that is important because it is a way to reflect on our work as historians and our way of reading history, or even interpreting what is written in, in the daily press. And that's, I think that it is more important for me, from my point of view, it's more important point in your book. It really helps us to confront our writing, our experience of historians, or our experience of readers of history. But also, maybe it is a way, this way, it is one more path to try to understand this afterlife in Israel. You mentioned Mahler, you mentioned, I think that more important that in the academy, this afterlife is present in the school system, in the Israeli school system, from the first, especially from the first decades, I would say, from the many first decades, and in the United States, through EVO and through other institutions that try to present themselves, or maybe try to become the inheritors of this tradition, but also in some way in Poland, after the war, because some of the young historians were working also in post-war Poland.
Yes. Wow. I wish we had a couple of hours for those points. So let me just touch on, because there is just a lot that you touched on and that you pushed this conversation in such interesting directions. But I want to, I want to go back to the mirror, the historians and their work being a mirror, and of course I agree, and I think that one aspect of this mirror, or this image in a mirror, that for me was interesting because and then you mentioned blind spots, right? And what we sort of take for granted, right? So there are two blind spots that for me are still exciting because of the contradiction with that accepted truism. One is politicization of interwar Polish Jewry, right? And in a way, my book, I don't think, contradicts the fact that, yes, people belonged to, especially the generation coming of age, and there are all these stories about siblings, and each sibling belonging to a different party and a different youth group, or crossing from one youth group to seemingly completely opposite ideologically group. And it's been beautifully argued by historians. At the same time, this is a non-partisan project. And what does it mean about the divisions, that you have a project in which Hillel Zeidman an Orthodox Jew and a rising star of yes, of Tzedei Aguda, right, sits in the same classroom and studies together with members of Poalei Zion left, or communists, and they sit together in the seminar at the university, and they sit together in Bawaban and other seminars, and they sit together in young historian circle. So it puts a certain question mark to, or kind of an additional nuance about this politicization and divisiveness of Jewish life. Doesn't take it away. And then something that I've been thinking about since the book was sent, the painful moment for an author when you can no longer change anything. But the question of the blind spots, turning your question a little bit on its head, the blind spots of these historians, where were their blind spots collectively? Of course, they each have their own project, but I tie them together with a collective project. And I think that this mantra of belonging and the hope for acceptance, however more nuanced than the generation of their teachers might have been, to what extent when Moshe Shor is discussing his view of Polish-Jewish relations a few weeks after the pogrom in Lvov in 1918, and he gives this fiery patriotic speech, of course mentioning history as well, and the bond with Poland, right? To what extent this is a discourse that could be thought of with this concept of subtenant, of someone who needs to reassert the place by saying things that are expected of him or her, right? Is this their blind spot? That certain things, whether consciously or not, they simply can't write. And what do we make of a much less tumultuous or lachrymose vision of Jewish history in a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, if we think about the concept of blind spots of these historians. Again, I don't think it takes away from questions they ask and answers they give, but I think that it creates several mirrors in a process of reading their work. Now, about the afterlife and the institutions, I was really struck finding that Isaiah Kupperstein and others organized a young historian circle in New York, EVA, many decades after the group was meeting in Warsaw, and that there was clearly a sense of reviving some kind of a collective intellectual project that seemingly was very distant from individual biographies of these New York participants who were, for the most part, students at Columbia University at that time. So, and again, this takes us to transnationalism that you mentioned earlier. I think I'll stop here because I also am trying to look at the questions, and some of them are very tempting, so I don't want to not take them at all. But thank you, Marcus. I wish we had another secret hour to continue.
We will have. You
will. You'll have another secret hour. Actually, some of the questions that are in the chat are connected to the things that you started to talk about. So first of all, I want to thank both of you for this conversation, and I'm going to continue reading the book so I have more insights. But I love this idea of the afterlife that Marcus was talking about, for sure. Actually, I want to go to the last question because you started talking about students that were studying in Colombia. So someone did mention Israel Cohen, and where do you place him as an English historian writing about Polish Jewish history, which is very interesting to think about what's going on. And if I can connect this to Dalia Offer's question about the Annales School in France, if you see an influence there. So I want to, take Marcus's question about the transnational. Is there some sort of, wider circle that everyone is looking at, or is everybody trying to be more local?
Anal questions, Dalia, thank you so much for this. Dragging this conversation quite literally out of Second Polish Republic across borders. So yes, definitely. And I think that here in a way, it's also another argument for how much this Polish Jewish project is connected to Polish intellectual project at the time, because the inspiration that comes from Annales School doesn't come to Jewish historians somehow independently. It comes through contacts of their teachers. Polish historiography, especially the let's use the slightly judgmental term, progressive, Handelsman, whom I mentioned earlier. These are scholars very much immersed in the French intellectual context and interested in the French, in a new approach. So it's definitely there. Now, I saw somewhere in the chat also Israel Halperin mentioned. Yes, I think we could. A lot of very seminal scholars, I think, could get an extra layer of interpretation in their work if we were to take this lens of not only Dubnovian tradition, which is usually applied when one works on Eastern European Jewish history, but also this Galician transformed into Polish school of historiography. I also saw, Madine, if I can just, yes. I was looking at the questions a little bit. There was a question about Shimon Ashkenazi, whom I would very much want to put here also into the conversation, because he's another, a little bit like a Handelsman. It's interesting that those ambivalent Jews that play very important role in how this project moves forward. And while Ashkenazi is still read as the best biographer of Prince Poniatowski, he is a romantic Polish historian par excellence, but he participates in various frameworks that propel the writing of Polish Jewish history. And I mentioned it in that book, the quarterly for the study of Polish Jewish history, and then the competition for the best academic work that is given through University of Lvov, although the money comes from Congress Poland, from Russian partition. And so, there is a tension that you can see from little bits of material. And this is something I want to stress as well, that there is a catastrophe at the end of the story. And there is Holocaust in the title, even though it's not a book about the Holocaust, because it is before the Holocaust. And part of it on my end as a researcher was just this wishful thinking about the letters that, I'm sure were written, but there is not a trace of them. Correspondence, notes, documents, personal documents. I was very much interested in bringing these scholars to life as full-blooded Polish Jews, but I had much more of their published work at my disposal than say, letters saying maybe some very ironic or sarcastic comments about the works of other historians, Jewish or otherwise. So there is a layer of personal networks, intellectual and personal networks that is very difficult to reconstruct with the material that did survive.
Which is very unfortunate. Maybe that is probably this afterlife that you're talking about. And I think my own, what I experienced as an academic in researching, I mean, am I writing a paper to please my professor in the right direction? Do I have my own direction? Am I trying to be, creative and, go out there? I mean, I can imagine that those things may come up in the academic work as well, if you can actually see the cynicism or the criticism as they're writing,
I actually can I just bring one example?
Yes.
Because this is this like morsel that gives you a taste of the meal that might simply not happen, which is one note written in the collection of Michael Gelber in the archives, in the Central Archives of the History of the Jewish People, where Amaisenova, who was a bibliographer and a librarian, writes, in Poland, the only person that can get funding for publishing books right now is Balaban. Nobody else. I mean, no one else among us has even a chance. And you get a glimpse of something that is not political and not ideological, and it's connected to simply shrinking resources. Now, we can argue whether this shrinking is not inherently political as well, of course, but one scholar looking at another scholar with resentment about the fact that he gets to publish his beautiful multi-volume history of the Jews in Krakow and Kazimierz because Bnei Brit is willing to fund it. Now, this also, I think, connects us contemporary historians to a lot of challenges that we face in our work, practical challenges. But this is the kind of inner life of this cohort that I was trying to, as much as possible, bring in this book.
So I want to say, again, thank you. And you can see in the chat that people are waiting to read the book. It's coming out July 1st. And I want to thank everybody for coming again today. Like Natalia said, we all can go out and, enjoy our Sundays doing other things, but you came to be with us today and we appreciate that. So
thank you. Toda raba. Thank you. Dziękuję. Adank.
Adank. Toda, Marcos.